by John Scopes and James Jim Presley.
Thank you, Randy. I have to thank Randy, first of all, because had it not been for him, I wouldn't be here, because he twisted my arm, twisted my arm, twisted my arm, and I said, ouch, ouch, yes, I'll go today. I'm very glad I did. Also, I want to thank Tom Davis, Sue Guffey, Pat Guffey, and the entire group of people who have made this possible. It's been an enjoyable weekend, and I was going to mention Todd Hatton, but I believe he's going to speak later, because Todd did work similar to Randy and resulted in a radio documentary on John Scopes' life called I Am John Scopes. See if there's anyone else. Well, there's a lot of people I left out, but and all of the others. And I appreciate that this weekend you have the Scopes Festival keyed to and focused on John Scopes himself, because without John Scopes, obviously there'd be no Scopes trial, and probably no trial in the state of Tennessee. It's very likely. It's very difficult to summarize one's relationship, close relationship, especially a person, in a few words. So I'll just hit some of the highlights, some of the memories that come forth. When I first met John Scopes in Shreveport, Louisiana, I had no inkling that we'd become fast friends, that we would collaborate on his memoirs, that he would dandle my son, smallest son then, he's a little bit heavier now, but going up, on his knee, and that I would be a pallbearer at his funeral 11 years later. When the book Center of the Storm came out, his memoirs, which I worked with him on, reporters routinely asked, how did you two get together? And I had a stock, rather bland reply to that. Well, we met at a social gathering in Shreveport. And this went along, and then one day in Dallas, a radio reporter rushed up out of breath and caught us out on the parking lot and asked if he could talk to us there. Sure. So he said, first question out of the box, how did you two men get together? And I said, well, we met at a social gathering in Shreveport. John broke in with a big grin on his face and said, what Jim's trying to tell you is that we got drunk together at a party in Shreveport. And that's mostly true. I was working at the Shreveport Times as a reporter then. I was there 1 year, and I met John Scopes about a month or so before I left for San Antonio. And it was a few years before we got back together after that initial meeting. I went to San Antonio and worked for the newspaper there. And then my mother was killed in a highway accident near Texarkana, where my parents lived. And being an only child, my wife and I had been married about 6 months by then. So we went to Texarkana and be close to my father and so forth. So I was a freelance writer, and sometimes they describe a freelance writer very independent, as a hog on ice. So I started looking around. Texarkana is not exactly the center of the universe. Some people may think so, but so I started fishing around my memory work, and I find within driving distance a subject. I thought John Scopes. So I wrote him a letter, and he was working at United Gas then as a consulting geologist, and told him that reminded we'd met at this party at Patsy Farmer's, who's a newspaper person. And by the way, at this party, mostly newspaper people. So, you know, it was not exactly a Sunday school class. And he wrote back and said, yes, I remember it well. I've never been so crocked in my life. So I went over and did the interview and wrote a piece for the American Weekly, which is a Sunday supplement. And after that, sometime, I would go over about once a month to Shreveport for allergy shots. And that would be long lasting. And while I was there, I would call John Scopes and just have lunch. So every time I went to Shreveport, we'd have lunch, and maybe for other reasons too. And so we didn't specifically talk about the trial of the case, but from time to time, we talked about a wide range of topics in which we had some common interests. Especially, I was very active in the environmental movement within, the home base. And we talked about, pollution, some of the topics that Jerry Tompkins has talked about. I remember one thing that John said that if we're building a society for a good super anthill, we're doing a good job. But I don't think that this is good for humanity to build another anthill. So we had a lot of common interest. But as we talked, once in a while he referred to personalities at the trial or the trial itself. Not because I'd asked the question, it just sort of fitted in the conversation. And it occurred to me that he had memories that had not been told. There was a Scope story, and it was his alone. So one day I proposed to him during the Memoirs. He said, sure, what do we want to do? He said, I'm retired now. Got time on my hands. What do we want to do? I didn't realize that casual agreement came after, at one of the interviews we did and promoted the book later. Someone asked him, has anyone else ever asked you to write the memoirs? He said, oh, dozens of people. I hadn't heard that. He said, but they wanted to tell their story. I think they want to project whatever their views were. And what I want to do is, I had a background in history in graduate school, and I wanted to get the John Scopes story from his eyes and from his memory. That would be one no one else. I didn't have an agenda except to get John Scopes' story on. So perhaps that was part of the thing. And I think we built up a rapport then, or I had. And that was a factor, although that was my first book. I've done a lot of writing in journals, magazines, and so forth, newspapers, but I've not done a book. And he was aware of that. It bothered me. And I told him, I said, I think it's important to get your story told. I don't necessarily have to do it someone who is, no, you're the one. So that's the way it went. The book had good reviews, and surprisingly, it had been so far back in time when he'd become world famous. You think, well, it was John Scopes, but enough people did. And he went on publicity tours in New York, Boston, and Philadelphia, which I think just about wore him out. This came out in 1967. But he, I think there was kind of he was surprised at the renewed interest in him personally and in the trial. But it was there. We had one of the things I remember that stood out is one of the editors at Holt, Reinhardt, and Winston, who had published the book, said, and I think it summed up the book, and it summed up John Scopes himself. This editor said, this really is a book about an American at his best. And I think that was it. He's low-keyed, like John, and whatever the controversy that swirled around him, his stood up for a principle that he believed in. And I think this is at the heart of it. He didn't want the limelight claimed him. It was unexpected fame. I'm sure it must have been. You imagine if you're 24, 25 years old, you're suddenly at the heart of a worldwide news cycle. Today, in 24 hours, John Scope, but it was pretty close to that then. Headlines in all the major newspapers. Thinking back to those days when I was a reporter for the Freeport Times, around the time I met John, there was a singer, piano player, and I'd be surprised if any or many of you remember the name now, Gene Austin. He became famous especially in 1927, see, just a couple of years after John Stewart became famous. His signature song was My Blue Heaven. He didn't write it, but it became famous. And it was on the charts #1 for about 13 weeks in 1927. Well, when I was a reporter there was an after-hours club, which newspaper people getting off late sometimes would go to. Gene Austin, to my surprise, I knew his name. I knew the song My Blue Heaven. I'd heard my father sing it. He played the piano at this place, and every night I'm sure he played and sang My Blue Heaven at least once or twice. Gene Austin, also nationally famous, was in Shreveport, Louisiana. And he was at, his career was largely back then. But I checked on him, this came to me just the other day, and I checked on Gene Austin. And to my surprise, he was born, I believe, in Gainesville, Texas, but he grew up in Minden, Louisiana, close to Shreveport. So that was why on his descending career move, he was in Shreveport playing an after-hours club. Now, Gene Austin was born in 1900. In the closing days of June 1900, about 6 weeks before John Scopes was born in Paducah, Kentucky, on August the 3rd, 1900. So you have a kind of parallel lives here. They were different. But Gene Austin needed to have attention because any performing artist has got to have an audience. So he wanted to get attention. John Scopes did not want to get attention, but got it anyway. But they were both famous in the 1920s. Gene Austin probably didn't have worldwide fame as John Scopes did. And they died within 2 years of each other. John died in 1970, and I believe Gene Austin died about 1972 or something like that. And so, although Gene Austin, as I said, needed and wanted attention, which is necessary to perform artists, John Scopes largely avoided it. And he said to me it's one of the most poignant passages in the book, because I put it exactly as he said. He just said, when the law school dean, University of Kentucky, where John intended to go on a scholarship, the expert witnesses had provided during the trial, he went up because he had majored in law as an undergraduate at the University of Kentucky, and he had in mind becoming a lawyer, a country lawyer. So he went to talk to the dean, and the dean said, "You can be another Clarence Darrow." He thought that would be motivating. It worked the opposite way. John Scopes didn't want to be another Darrow because he didn't want to spend his life in the shadow of another man. be almost impossible to even meet the expectations. So he said, I wanted to be myself. I can remember now when he said that. There was a tug in his voice, as there tends to be in my voice when I repeat it. But I think he fulfilled that. He wanted to be himself, and largely he did that. Out of the many scenes that stand out, of course I can only select a few. We went to, after the book came out, we went to Dallas and Garland, Texas for one weekend. And they had a luncheon, annual luncheon of the Friends of the Library in Garland, Texas. And John and I appeared there as major speakers. And during it, he gave a relaxed, folksy talk, which they loved. Crowded. They'd been at a news conference in Dallas. You'd be surprised, it was filled the room. Here's a man from 1925 when he really drew a crowd of huge people. So at the end of his talk in Garland, he said, I just wanted to come down to you, see you, and show you that I don't have horns. He said, he turned to Juliet, I don't even have a tail. He walked down the crowd. And this told you a lot. He could, when he spoke off the cuff, he had used no notes. He just spoke from his heart and memories. And I think he connected with the crowd like that. Unfortunately, all good things in lives end. One day in 1970, I had a hurried note from Mildred Scopes that her husband's exploratory operation had revealed inoperable cancer, and they just sewed him back up. So after that, and he was bedridden from then on, after that I went over to Shreveport, 75 miles from Texarkana to Shreveport. Went over as often as I could. We visited as old friends should, with with comfort, and we talked about as we did any other time. That's often an awkward time when you know what is going on, but it didn't seem to make any difference. He was not afraid to die, but he said, I wouldn't mind hanging around just to see how it all turns out. Continued interest in the world. It was still an interesting place. And a man with the curiosity that he had displayed, the pursuit that was to be expected. Then one morning, I had a call from Mildred that John had passed away. And she asked me to be a pallbearer. I told her to be honored. By the way, I talked to the law wives in Texarkana quite a few years ago, and several years after John had died. And we got to this point, and I did the same thing. My wife said, you should never speak about John Scopes again. I'm sorry. But after the funeral, the pallbearer's car drove to the funeral home where the body would be taken by hers to Paducah for burial. And we were all silent, each with his own private memories. And then Ray Volk, DOL, came, one of his old friends there at Shreveport. He suddenly broke the silence and he said, he was a great guy. I think that was a perfect epithet. I couldn't think anything to add to that. So today, I want to come to Dayton, channeling the spirit of John Scopes, where he made headlines over 90 years ago. Unexpected headlines. And borrow from his example to show that despite my close association with him, neither do I have horns, and I don't even have a tail. Thank you very much.